Hello and welcome to Transforming Tomorrow, the podcast from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability and Business here in Lancaster University Management School. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Babington.
Jan, we're expanding the horizons of the Pentland Centre again today. We're going beyond the management school and we're going to say hello to Professor Alona Armstrong. Now, Alona's a member of the Lancaster Environment Centre and she's the director of another research centre here at the university, that's Energy Lancaster, and she specialises in solar parks and their effects on biodiversity.
What's lovely about Energy Lancaster and the Pentland Centre is that we're quite good buddies, and so we have a crossover of membership between the two institutions, which is really good. But also I feel in the Pentland Centre we're kind of we're sustainability and business, so if you like we have a really strong organisational science focus, whereas what we kind of lack is that depth of expertise in the ecological space, and this is where we really managed to achieve that through partnerships like we have with Energy Lancaster. So welcome, Alona. Really pleased that you've come along.
Thank you for the invite.
Can I confirm, first of all, that you do get along with the Pentland Centre and there aren't just big internecine rivalries that take place across all research centres in the university?
I simply couldn't comment.
Yeah. I can see how this podcast is going to go.
So, Alona, can you tell us a little bit about your academic background and the kind of research questions that you look at?
Okay, yep, sure. So I would term myself as an environmental scientist, and throughout my career I have been called a hydrologist, a geomorphologist, an ecologist. So I've moved within environmental science, but one thing that's been kept steady is looking at the effects of land management on the environment. So historically, I did a lot of work on peatlands and looking at peatland management activities. And then probably about 10 to 15 years ago, I undertook a project on wind farms on peatlands. And at that point, I then pivoted to energy because I saw the potential. It was really interesting. It was really topical. And it was going to be a really exciting growth area.
Assuming it wasn't an insult when you were called it, what did people mean when they called you a geomorphologist?
So that's about looking at the shape of the land, essentially the shape of the landscape.
I'm glad it wasn't an insult.
It was touch and go, Paul, but you
can never quite be sure. I've been called lots of things in my time.
Travelling on the train and just being around the landscape, you start to see more solar parks on the land. I hear a lot of chatter and I read a lot of things in the newspapers, as will our listeners as well. So I think we maybe should start right back from the beginning and tell us about how does a solar park come into being?
Oh, that's a good question. Do you want a fun fact first?
Yes, indeed.
Do you know how many solar parks there are in the UK?
No.
Well, come on, take a guess, Jan. Take a guess.
300.
7.
There's over 1,000.
Wow.
Over 1,000. Yeah. But often they're hidden in the landscape, right? So hedges get put up to screen them. And they're generally low-lying, unlike wind turbines. So there's actually an amazing amount of solar parks across the UK. I really thought
that was a trick question, that there was only going to be so few a number of solar parks, and that's why I went for 7, and now I just feel foolish.
Well, you're gaming the system, but you're right, because I see more of them from the trains than I do from anywhere else, because they're tucked away in bits of agricultural land, and I'm sure we'll come back to that fact as well.
So tell us a little bit about them then.
The question. So back to the question you asked. So what was it? So how do they come into being?
Yeah.
So originally, the solar parks really kicked off in the UK because the government released a subsidy called the feed-in tariff, which was really economically attractive. And I don't actually know whether they intended solar parks to be built on land or whether they were trying to stimulate growth on rooftops. But the subsidies were so financially appealing and people started building them out on land in 2011 or so. That really started the history of solar parks in the UK, and then since then subsidies have been slowly reduced, and now they're financially viable without any subsidies. In terms of where they're put, the biggest factor is the grid connection. Our electricity kind of system was designed for point source, large coal, gas and nuclear power plants. And now we want to put, with solar, you're putting in more smaller units and there's not always space to take that amount. It goes on the smaller cables, if you like, and there's not always space for all the power to come out. So the grid is a really strong determinant of where they get put. And then obviously you need the landowner to be in agreement. and then it needs to go through planning.
And it's quite interesting there you say the landowner needs to have agreement. So is the landowner the person doing solar parks, or are they merely giving their land for a period of time for a lease payment, or a magical mix of both of those things?
It's definitely a magical mix. So I think on the whole, I think the land tends to be leased. I would say it's not my area of expertise, but my best guess would be that on the whole, the land tends to be leased. But there are places where they kind of develop and build them for themselves. So, for example, that's what this university, Lancaster University, is doing. And then one of the earlier solar parks in the UK in Derbyshire was built by Toyota. It was in their grounds nearby, and they used all the power directly in their plant.
Oh, that's a really interesting model as well. And so how long does a solar park or solar plant, is that different from solar park? I don't know. How long do these things last?
So originally, so they can be called solar parks, solar farms, solar plant. Some people call them utility scale solar, but utility scale means about the size.
Yeah.
But they're generally built on the ground unless you've got a really big rooftop. So how long do they last? So originally they went into planning for 25 years, and I think that's because they borrowed that from the wind industry, because that's how long wind turbines tend to last, and they've got moving parts, and there's strong reasons for that. But what happened after a few years is that I guess they realised they don't have moving parts and they might last longer. So a lot of sites went for planning extensions up to about 40 years, and now so new planning applications might be somewhere between the two.
I guess you'd only find out how long it lasts when they run out. This is the first time. It sounds like 2011 was when the big push started, maybe around then. So nothing has been around long enough to be able to tell, oh, that's how long it's going to last.
Yeah, I think they can be pretty sure, because we've had solar panels around for like lots of years, so they do produce a bit less over time. And there might be a point where they're not producing as much, and they call it repowering, where they might replace the panels. The other infrastructure used to put them in place is, essentially bits of kind of steel pushed into the ground. So that's pretty assured on the lifetime site. I do think they will last that long, but what might change is that new PV developments come out, and therefore it makes it more cost effective to renew the panels, or a different energy technology altogether might come along. And
is there any kind of difference between solar plants and sort of smaller solar outlets? Like you're seeing lots of them on roofs of houses and factories. Is there any difference in the technology that's there, or is it all the same sort of thing?
No, generally the technologies, again, it's not strictly speaking my area, but my understanding of all the technology is pretty much the same, whether it's on roof or on the ground. Panels on satellites are different. They have different properties, but they're in a very different environment. And there is lots of development on different sorts of PV technologies. It's not really my area, but I know there's different sorts, and there's different pros and cons of each, and there's lots of R&D going into it.
That sounds amazing. Well, like all new technologies, there are, of course, problems with public acceptability and how they might achieve their outcomes, but also huge benefits from new technology. So I'm wondering if you could talk us through solar energy in terms of benefits, the challenges, and how that whole field of activity is shaping up.
Complex question, lots of parts to it. In terms of the technology, one of the key benefits of solar is it's cheap. And given, kind of the economic framework kind of we operate in, that's a significant advantage of solar. And solar has consistently outperformed projections, regardless of who those projections were made by, like the International Energy Association, or people like Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth have energy projections. And all of them, solar's consistently outperformed their connections. And a lot of that, I think, is to do with the price, that the decrease in costs through time. The other good things about solar is that it's a really flexible technology. And by flexible, I mean in terms of size of deployments. You could have, in some locations, there might be one solar panel on a roof to power a fridge or to power some mobile phones. Or you might get, kind of 350 megawatt or even larger. I can't remember how much the larger site is, but, massive scale ground mount systems. But it's also flexible about where you can put it. You can put it on the roof of buildings. Some buildings have facades down the sides. You can put it on land. You can float it on water. Some places have walkways with solar parks over the top. The French government legislated a certain capacity of solar had to be put over car parks. And obviously in France, where it's much hotter, people want to park their cars in shade. And so it's really flexible in that means as well. I do believe you can also get flexible solar. So potentially you could even make clothes out of it. But definitely there's flexible material you could perhaps roll out and roll in. So I think that really helps cost and flexibility in terms of scale, but also how you can deploy it. It makes it really popular. There's also sun everywhere. So that means the resource across the globe. So it's not just a one nation or a certain region. And if it's economically viable in the northwest of England, and because there's another form of solar, which is concentrating solar power, and that needs direct irradiance, so like direct light from the sun, but PV panels can handle light that's been scattered and can still, so that's why you still generate a bit on cloudy days as well.
I love the idea of solar powered clothes that are maybe charging the phone that's in your pocket. I don't know if that's what you'd use it for, but that's in my mind. And also when we talked about satellites having solar panels, I immediately thought of the James Bond film where they have diamonds that absorb all the light and they fire a laser that blows up parts of the world.
I think that you are on a tangent, but I like your tangent.
That wasn't. This was not my next question. It's just things that I thought of as you were talking. Wonderful use of solar power. Let's use them to make a James Bond satellite. No, you've mentioned there that a power plant up to 350 megawatts. So approximately how much power are you getting from that, or something of a different size? How many megawatts powers how many homes?
How good are you at maths, Paul? So what I do know,
go on.
What I do know is the Lancaster solar park that was spec'd up to be 16.5 megawatts. That's big enough to produce electricity for 3,500 homes.
Right, that's approximately 75,000 homes are going to be powered by 350 megawatts.
That maths was a bit quicker than we were led to believe you were going to go for.
Yeah, I do maths. I just try not to.
Fair enough.
And obviously, like where it is affects how much power it's going to produce as well, right?
Yeah.
So if you're somewhere sunnier and so on and so forth.
Some of the things our listeners may have read in the newspapers is this sort of contestation between should you use land for solar parks, should you use it for agricultural land? And I know that the answer to that is going to be it's complex, but maybe if you can draw out the dimensions for our listeners as to how you make that deal work in people's minds and in the planning process.
Yeah, it is tricky. And land is such a finite resource, and as our population increases and our demands per capita, what we want from the land increases. So recreation, food, fibre, energy. There's increasing competition on land, and we need to think really strategically about how we use it. Obviously, in some places that's more critical. So places like Singapore, higher populations, lower land areas, it's pretty tricky. In the UK, we're pretty constrained, and Midwest US, there's quite a lot of space. So it is challenging. Renewables take up 2 orders of magnitude more land than conventional, so nuclear, gas and coal. So unless we go down the nuclear route, and the UK is bucking the trend a bit by building new nuclear, and new nuclear is really expensive, and it also takes really long time to build, so from first conception to operational, maybe 30 years. So we don't have time, given our climate targets, to decarbonise through nuclear, and there's some other, it's not, you can't turn it up and down so easily to meet demand. So that produces challenges. So that means we are looking at the minute towards renewables, and they do take up more space, and that is the bottom line. And as I said, we need that space for other things as well. We need it for food, recreation, cultural values. And how you trade that off is simply just really challenging, and it's a value decision, and there's lots of factors that will come into it. So ideally, you would put solar on roofs or integrate into structures where it's not taking up new space. But one of the big constraining factors there is the grid. And unless we get a grid upgrade or people use it directly and there's local storage and local systems, that's always going to be a big determinant where it gets put, and might mean it gets put on land that ideally, we wouldn't like it to be put on. Our agricultural land in the UK is divided into grades, and I'm sure, and the highest grades, which are 1, 2 and 3A, is considered the best and most versatile land, and I'm sure you'll have seen, and it comes up in politics and has been covered in mainstream news about should solar, it's allowed to go on 3B and below, but there's been questions when Liz Truss was in power, is should it be allowed on 3B? So there's loads of debate around that, but also what's ongoing is that land classification was done some years ago, and our spatial understanding and our spatial data products and our understanding of our soils and how they function has come on since then. And also climate change has happened. I think it'll be really good to update what that best and most versatile land is, because I'm not sure I think it could be a better data product to help define these decisions. The other thing that's coming in is the change in agricultural subsidies. Post-Brexit, so there was a single basic payment scheme, and now it's going to switch to a sustainable farming initiative, and that's going to affect the financial viability of farms. So farmers may be in a position where they need to look to diversify to help the economics. With that change in subsidies, I'm sure there'll be winners and there'll be losers. So that's another factor that will come into play. And I think stepping back, so we've got a lot of there's a lot of food sovereignty, and we're used to very agricultural landscapes, and that's really important, and it's part of our heritage, and we don't want to lose that. There's also a massive, and people are worried about food security, and as we should be. There is also a massive change in our energy system ongoing, and once our coal plant are completely off, a lot of our nuclear fleet is due to be decommissioned by 2035, and we need to get off gas because of climate targets. So we also run the risk of becoming energy insecure. So then how do you trade off food security and energy insecurity? And so that's the big scale stuff. And then you look at the local scale, okay, this bit of land, should we put it here? Can we put it here? What does that bit of land mean to people that live around it? What is that land currently for? And so it's just really tricky.
I can imagine we'll be having a series with the Lake District farmers coming up, and we'll be talking to them about net zero and how they can do net zero as farms. And this would be something that would be fascinating to ask them about, if this is a potential, if they can source their energy from something like solar to do that.
And I think the other thing that your answer really draws out, particularly for our listeners, is that any headline that says X is the answer should be treated with great suspicion because there's all of that complexity there.
Yeah, there is. But there is also hope. So we're hoping to get some research going on something called agrivoltaics, and this is coupling food and energy.
Cool.
So it could be a win-win if done well and in the right place. And there's different forms of agrivoltaics. So they could be ground mount system with grazing underneath. And a researcher I work with has looked at the impact of the microclimate, the change in light and temperature conditions under the panel, what that means for forage quality. And that could have implications for kind of stocking densities. Also, not necessarily in the northwest, but a colleague in California is looking at co-locating cattle and solar because cattle experience heat stress. So are there animal livestock welfare benefits of it? There's also generally in sunnier climates, there's been trials, but also now commercial systems of growing crops under solar because there's too much light there. And it's in places where they might have done intercropping to provide shade to some species or use shade cloth to cut it out. So there is really hope there. And then looking at integrating PV on glass houses as well and providing a power supply. And this could be also really appealing to the agricultural sector because as energy costs rise, if they can have their own sources with kind of assured costs, that could really help agricultural businesses as well. So there is hope.
If we can just go back slightly to geopolitics for a minute, a topic I'm always keen to discuss, obviously. And you talked about energy sovereignty. Now, with something like gas, you can build a pipeline to bring gas power in. With coal, you can put it on a ship and you can bring that in. Is it a possibility to import something like solar power? Because like you say, you need things like storage, you need batteries, you'll need some kind of massive cable network, I would think, somehow to get that transported from one country to another. Is that a possibility that solar power could be shared between countries that are thousands of miles away?
Yep. I mean, it happens. We've got interconnectors to several countries, France being one of them. So what would be really neat is that if we could distribute renewables across, I guess it would be across a continental scale. So you can have wind and solar and hydro. And if you can distribute, and there's been research done on this, you distribute them smartly. So if it's cloudy in Lancaster, it's sunny in the south of France, or it's windy in Hamburg, and then you can then even out the intermittency in the renewables and provide an assured supply, and then use some form of storage to back up. I mean, and there's papers that have done that and shown that it's theoretically possible, but there's that, the politics and the geopolitics could be challenging there.
In my mind, you look at certain stretches of Africa that are covered in desert, for instance, where it's just perennially sunny and hot. And if there was a way of somehow being able to build solar plants on, say, the Sahara Desert, I know you've got issues with shifting sand dunes, which are totally beyond the remit of this conversation. But if you could somehow have a network that could link somewhere that it is renowned for being sunny, and you're able to generate that energy and transport that across the world, that would seem to be a wonderful solution, albeit entirely idealistic.
Yeah, so I mean, solar panels actually in the south of England can produce more than in Bavaria and Germany, because they need sun, but they also are more efficient if they're cooler.
Ooh.
So ideally we want solar in cool, sunny places. The other thing that I feel uncomfortable about the thought of deploying loads of solar in sub-Saharan Africa. We can't keep offshoring all our problems, and whilst we might see, and my someone who's used to living in the Northwest, my Californian colleague, does work in the desert, and I'm like, it's just dry there, it's not that important, is it? And she's like, no, it's they're important ecosystems, they're fragile ecosystems. Some of her work has linked the impact of solar, I think it was concentrating solar power, to indigenous populations. So wherever you do it, there's people, there's culture, there's value, there's ecosystem, there's biodiversity, and we can't just keep on offshoring all our problems.
I think that's a really great insight. And so we're going to, this is another offshoring question, so you have to forgive me. Is that earlier you talked about floating solar plants, and of course the ocean is not an empty space, which we know from our prior conversations with both JB and Celine, who are looking at the ocean ecology, but also the ocean economy as well. So before we move on to, say, maybe looking at solar parks and biodiversity, can you just tell our listeners a little bit about floating solar plants, because it sounds like sci-fi.
Just before I have to say, I'd not thought about it as oceans. I was thinking about it on lakes. That's how I thought. When I thought it was floating solar plants, I thought lakes, something like that, so that it's a lot more easily manageable. You're not worrying about it floating off and ending up in Norway.
And possibly reservoirs as well, because they're already there holding water.
Yeah.
But why are we talking to each other about this?
Ask the expert on this?
Yeah, let's get back in our boxes.
Alona, do you have an opinion?
Luckily, you're both right.
That doesn't happen often.
No competition there. So we're actually I'm doing some work with some people on floating solar in the UK, and they're on reservoirs, and water companies are deploying them because they can, and they can provide, they'll either connect them to the grid or they'll spec out the solar arrays so they can use the power directly in the water treatment plant. And that is looking to expand. As with ground mount system, it's about where you put them and how you manage them. So I can't see the Lake District lakes getting covered in solar PV. And in sunnier climates, so the first commercial floating solar PV system was deployed at Far Ninth, might not be pronouncing that right, winery in California. And they had the choice of, they had a agricultural, like an irrigation pond. They had a bit of ground mount already, and then they had the choice of taking out a bit more of their vineyard, essentially, their growing area, and converting it to solar. Or they thought, or we could try and put it on this irrigation pond. Obviously, California's quite hot, evaporation rates are quite high, there can be water scarcity issues. So they actually built it on the irrigation pond, and they saved, I can't remember the figure, maybe $150,000 a year in lost revenue in terms of reduction in wine output because of the amount of area of vineyard they had to take out. So that was the first commercial array. So that has co-benefits beyond the electricity because it reduces evaporation. Not so much a problem in the northwest, and there is actually a floating solar array on Lancaster Reservoir about 3 miles down the road. And there's been chat about putting them on, water corridors and canals, again, intentionally to stop evaporation. And then offshore, I think it's a Dutch company, maybe a Danish company that have put a test rig out in the North Sea, but they appear to be, it's at the edge of my knowledge now, it appears to be a bit more common nearer the equator where the waves are perhaps a bit less wavy, and so it's a bit easier to tether them out. And I think there's less understanding of what happens, what the impact of floating solar ground mount.
I think the thing is, this is going to keep on evolving, and we're going to keep on learning new things. And I think any application of research that involves winery is something that you want to be intimately involved in.
I'd also like to add waves that are too wavy to various other things that we've had during the course of this podcast.
Trees that are too leafy.
Trees that are too leafy, and wind that's too windy. And yes, so that is also, and also solar panels that like it to be cold rather than hot.
That's really cool, isn't it?
Yeah.
So Alona and I are working on a project looking at biodiversity in solar park settings. So this might be a good time to open up that box of how does solar parks and biodiversity interact together, and what kind of work are you doing in that area? And I know that our joint project is probably a small chunk of it. You're doing a lot more than just our joint project. So tell us about it.
So and this is where this research really started. Essentially, so I'd started a fellowship, and this company came to Lancaster University and said, we're solar developers. We want to do good for ecology and biodiversity, but we don't know what we're doing because we're solar developers. And I was like, oh, yeah, good point. And we knew there was a lot of potential, because often there's 5 things about solar which give potential, if done well and in the right place, for them to be really good for biodiversity. So 1, they're paid for 25 to 40 years. So there's enough time for things to develop, because the responsive of some parts of the ecosystem, like soil, takes a while to respond. The land is paid for through rent, so there's not any pressure to use them for anything else. So you can give them over to biodiversity. They're secure environments, so they're not that disturbed. You'll perhaps get a car or a small van with a technician to go in and maintain, or they'll be washed every now and then, but generally there's very little disturbance. And the 4th is the physical structures create microclimatic niches, so it creates diversity in climate, which can be good for a lot of species. There are 5. I can only remember 4 at the moment. It's the pressure of the interview.
I don't need to be under all of this pressure. If Jan works on this project with you, Jan, do you know what number 5 is?
I don't, because I do the counting numbers on the side.
This is all about numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If
I think we've misunderstood my discipline, Paul.
Sorry, Alona. I just want. Sometimes we have to make sure that Jan does know what's going on there.
So the first project we did was a collaboration with a colleague, Piran White, at the University of York, and we developed a decision support tool called SPIES, best acronym of my career, which stands for Solar Park Impacts on Ecosystem Services, and that essentially uses a peer-reviewed evidence database to help people decide how they will manage their solar parks. So, and it's really actionable things like kind of the timing of the grazing, do you install certain habitats, do you kind of plant wildflowers, etc. And then it tells you what the impact on ecosystem services are, from significantly degrading them to significantly enhancing them. So that was the first project, and then it's really built from there. One of my researchers, Holly Blades, has done her PhD on pollinators, so looking at what pollinators need and then how you could support them in solar parks to providing those resources. Some work on soils by Fabio and Lucy, looking at what happens to soil within solar parks. Lucy's also done some work on what happens to the quality of the forage. And so just trying to build up understanding and data sets to work out. And then increasingly, through the project with you, Jan, like trying to get that into decisions. Because I think one of the reasons why the environment is in the state it is, and why the biodiversity is lost is as it is because it's really hard to put a cost on the environment, therefore it doesn't get taken into decisions, and therefore it gets degraded. So
I guess then, Alona, just to draw this to a conclusion, so what are the big questions that still need to be addressed in terms of energy, carbon impacts, and everything to do with solar, really?
That is a big question, isn't it?
A really big question.
That is a big question. I mean, for me, the ultimate question, which is far beyond the research I do, is, where can you best put it, take into account economics, politics, society and environment? That's the big question. And or even how do you bring all those things together to make the best decision? That's a big question, perhaps intractable. In terms of my research, I think there's still a lot of, we don't actually have that much field data. So we can, and because the climate is different there in a unique way because of the shading, I think we could, and the diversity in sites in terms of the soil type, the climate, how they're managed, what the physical infrastructure of the solar park is. It would be really good to get more data. And we're actually working, and we've been collaborating with a couple of ecological consultants and Solar Energy UK to come up with a standardised monitoring protocol that then industry apply to their site. So it's kind of like a citizen science approach where they collect the data in a way that we would never get research funding to do, and then we can analyse it and start to back out what the impact's actually having. So that's quite exciting, and that's in its second year now, and more sites are coming online. Yeah, so some more field data. And then I'm also really interested in this agrivoltaics question, because I think there is potential there for win-win. But again, you need the technology, you need the economics, you need the politics and the social and the environment all to come together. But I think there is hope and lots to do there.
That's great. Although if there's one thing I think I've learned during the course of this podcast is that bringing all of those elements together in anything is difficult. So I will keep all fingers crossed that does happen for you, Alona. Well, that's been a wonderful discussion. Now, what we haven't discussed at all is the Lancaster Environment Centre, or indeed Energy Lancaster, who they are and what they do. So I suggest, Jan, that we come back and reconvene for a special little bonus episode later this week where we can do that.
I think it's a grand idea.
Well, until then, thank you very much, Alona, and we will be back next time. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Babington.